So hello Darragh. So your new novel, Remembrance Sunday, Le Dimanche du souvenir, has just been published in France at Éditions Belfond, and I had the privilege to be your translator once again. It is quite different from the previous one. All that is solid melts into air, tout ce qui est solide se dissout dans l'air, and at the same time, there are themes which we find in both novels. To sum it up, Simon, at 13, is a victim of the bombing at Enniskillen by the IRA in 1987. He's not hurt physically, but soon starts having seizures. With medication, the seizures stop, but return 30 years later, just after he left his wife. It gets so bad, he might have to be operated on, but he starts on another path, reflecting on what could have been the life of the terrorist who planted the bomb and his motivations. So my first question is about the structure of the novel. As a matter of fact, it is divided into two parts, the part with Simon and the fiction in the fiction, which Simon is inventing. Both are very different. The characters, the plot, the writing even is very different. How did you come to choose such a structure? How did it come up?
I suppose the structure came out of a couple of things. One was that I was tending to read a lot of fiction around that time that I was getting frustrated with fictional characters, that they didn't seem like real people. And so I suppose there was some need in me to show the creation of a character on the page. So I think Simon is doing that with the Brendan character, that we create a character from nothing. You know, that it's not, Brendan's not a fully formed life that it is already living, that we're tapping into. We see Simon giving the creation of Brendan, like he's bringing a character to life. So I think that was something that I wanted to explore, but also it really came out of the writing of Simon as a character. And I was very careful when I was writing both sections in the section to be very distinct about the fact that it's Simon writing this character of Brendan rather than me. So all of the perspectives, all of the kind of intuition, you know, I was almost inventing a writer who was then writing a character. So I had to really go through the sensibility that I'd set up in order to write the other character.
Okay, so the main thing of the book is violence, as it was in your former book.
Yeah.
The main characters, Simon and Brendan, are like the two sides of a coin in a way. Simon is a victim of violence and Brendan inflicts violence. But of course, it's not that simple. Simon, in a way, is also his own victim out of guilt. And Brendan himself has been a victim of violence before as a boy. Violence begets violence. Is it possible to break this vicious circle of violence?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say peace begets peace. You know, one of the reasons that I was interested in the Enniskillen bombing in particular was it was a really important moment in the history of the Troubles. There was a man who was involved, his name was Gordon Wilson, and his daughter Marie died in the bombing. And she was a nurse, and he was holding her hand actually as she was dying. And he was on the national news that evening, and he made a statement to say that, you know, he didn't hold any ill will against the IRA. And it became this extraordinary kind of catalyst for, I suppose it put a pause a little bit on the kind of the waves and the torrent of rage. That just this very simple statement of, you know, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a refusal to hate, kind of stemmed that tide a little bit. So, you know, Northern Ireland is interesting, and the Troubles are interesting in that I think when you're within that kind of, those kind of waves and that escalation of violence, it's very difficult to see a way out. But the Troubles have proved that is possible. You know, we're 30 years in, and with a peace treaty that's held very strong and very securely. So, you know, I think some of the themes in the book are around violence, but I think they're also around belief, how we construct our beliefs and how we form a kind of a belief system. And I think that each one of us, we can have beliefs imposed on us institutionally, but essentially it is down to the individual each individual constructs their own belief system. And that belief system can be based on violence, but it can also be based on peace.
So in the conflict in Northern Ireland, there is the IRA, which is fighting against the British occupation and targeting the military. But as you said, after the Enniskillen bombing, 13 civilians were killed and no military. So the question is there a limit or an acceptable level of violence in fighting an abusive state, as in this conflict?
Well, I think one of the things I wanted to show was that, you know, I think historically the IRA, or the provisional IRA, sprang out of, I suppose, very severe social injustices and a military occupation. But I think some of the patterns of revolutions is that, you know, even though there may be strong moral cause for the beginning of one of those campaigns, very quickly it descends into criminality. And I think the IRA, after a certain amount of time, I suppose a momentum takes over, kind of bloodlust takes over, and people become attracted to the situation just based on the capacity to enact violence. I think violence kind of creates its own reality. So, yeah, I suppose what I was showing in the book, and I think Remembrance Sunday, or the Remembrance Sunday bombing in particular, that was a moment where I think the greater populace, the support for the IRA just dropped off very quickly, because actually there's nothing that you can do to justify that situation where, you know, previously, not exclusively, but previously they would have given bomb warnings or made sure that civilians were not in that situation. But the Enniskillen bombing deliberately targeted civilians, and I think the IRA had got to that point where it was a movement that had got out of control, and it was largely motivated by criminality and violence.
Okay, so there is a category of people in the book who never resort to violence. It's women. Mm-hmm. So whatever was done to them, they don't resort to violence. They are mostly there to heal the wounds, like Simon's mother and Brendan's wife, who are both nurses. And later in New York, it is Esther and Hing who mainly take care of Simon and help him get back on tracks. So is violence the realm of men only?
Well, I would say there's a very violent character in the female character in Camille, who's Simon's ex-wife, who tries to kill him in a car. Yeah, I think throughout the book I'm not saying...
Well, she's the exception because she's not Irish, she's French.
that I can't speak to. But I think, yeah, I mean, of course women are very capable of violence. I think that's a different book. Brendan's wife was an interesting character because as I was writing her, she felt like she was very three-dimensional and interesting and conflicted. And I was writing larger sections involving her actually, but it began to take away from the main theme of the book, and I kind of had to make some decisions in terms of where my narrative focus was going. So I think even though a lot of the women in the book are secondary characters, I really spent a lot of time really making sure that they were as complete and as complex and as dimensional as the main characters. Women, of course, are very capable of violence. There was a lot of stories came out in the aftermath of the Troubles of, I can't remember, I think they were called letterbox assistants. But there was a thing in Belfast where when there was Republican snipers on the streets in Belfast, and they'd have a gun pointed behind the letterbox. And so they'd hide in a house, and the letterbox would be covering their gun. And various girls would stand on the street and wait for the British soldiers to pass, and then they'd open the letterbox at an opportune moment, and the sniper would hit, and then, take refuge in these houses and in the back lanes. And there were very prominent IRA members who were female as well. So it's not that women were excluded from the violence or are excluded from the violence. They're very capable of it too.
Okay, so still about women. Violence brings trauma, and this could be a summary of Simon's life. But Brendan also was traumatized by the violence inflicted upon him by the military, the British military, and Esther also was traumatized by the brutal experience of being an outcast because as a teenager she was pregnant after she had an affair with a married man, and then she was compelled to abandon her child who was adopted right after being born. And Esther is saved by art, while Simon is saved from trauma through fiction. So my last question is, can art and fiction save us?
Yeah, that's a good one. There's a quote by Nietzsche that I often think about, which he says that we have art so we will not be destroyed by the truth. And I think that's an interesting line, actually, because you can take that two ways. One way you can take it is to say that art is a distraction, and that we can distract ourselves and numb ourselves by art to the reality of what's going on. I think we do that a little bit with, you know, we delve into TV series and we kind of, I remember Edward Snowden, when he was doing his interviews with The Guardian, you know, he was saying that one of his decisions to come out and reveal the CIA documents was that, you know, he had his nice job when he was living in Hawaii, and he had $200,000 a year, and most people in his position went home and watched their TV shows. So I do think there's a sense that there's all these narratives around us at the moment, and I think some of their purpose is to dull us from the political realities of the world. At the same time, art can also be a way of articulating possibility and truth. I think of Rumi's statement where he says, like, between right and wrong there is a field, let me take you there. And I think art can articulate that field and illustrate that field and help us see the possibilities of something other than the reality that we're inside.
Okay, thank you very much, Darragh, and thank you to the Irish Cultural Centre, because we are right now in the Historical Library. Thank you.
Thank you, Carine.